The exposition of Preludes sets the scene for the whole poem to come. It starts out by saying, "Winter evening settles down with smell of steaks and passageways, 6 o'clock." So you kind of really don't know what's going on at all until you keep reading further into the poem. The narrative hook of the poem is the whole first movement of the poem. It says, "And newspapers from vacant lots the showers beat on broken blinds and chimney pots, and at the corner of the street a lonely cab horse steeps and stamps in the lighting of the lamps." So you just want to kind of figure out what. The rising action of Preludes takes place in the second movement in the beginning of the third, when the poem states, "With the other masquerades, that time resumes, one thinks of all the hands that are raising dingy shades in 1,000 furnished rooms." The climax of Preludes takes place in the middle of the third movement, where the poem states, "You dozed and watched the night revealing the 1,000 sordid images of which your soul was constituted. They flickered against the ceiling." The falling action of Preludes takes place in the middle of the fourth movement. The poem states, "And short square fingers stuffing pipes, and evening newspapers, and eyes, assured of certain certainties, the conscience of a blackened street, impatient to assume the world." The resolution of the poem takes place at the end of the fourth movement, which is also the end of the entire poem. The last 3 lines of the poem state, "Wipe your hands across your mouth and laugh. The worlds revolve like ancient women, gathering fuel in vacant lots." The exposition of the demon lover takes place when the main character, Mrs. Drover, is back in her apartment in London. She's back from their summer home to grab a few things because they weren't staying in the apartment because of all the bombs that were going off in London at the time. The narrative hook of the demon lover takes place when Mrs. Drover is getting ready to leave the apartment. She notices that there is a letter addressed to her sitting on the kitchen table. She's confused as to how it could be there because the caretaker was out of town and no one had been in the apartment for months prior to her visit there. The rising action of the demon lover takes place when Mrs. Drover has a memory of herself as a teenager with a soldier before he leaves for war. The odd thing about her memory is that she can't remember what the soldier looks like. She can't remember what his face looks like. She can only see the picture of his uniform as he's telling her goodbye. The climax of the demon lover occurs when Mrs. Drover runs out of her apartment in search of a taxi. She got herself very worked up in her apartment and she felt like someone was watching her and she was starting to feel uncomfortable. So she kind of just ran out with her packages and she wanted to find a taxi right away. The falling action in the demon lover is when Mrs. Drover finally finds a taxi to get in. And when she gets in, she finds out that the taxi driver is the soldier from her past. The thing that makes this part really mysterious is that the soldier was presumed dead in the war, and everyone thought he was dead. There's no real definite resolution in The Demon Lover. When the story ends, you never really find out what happens to Mrs. Drover. All you know is that she's in the taxi with her old ghosts from the past that came back to haunt her, and they're driving. And that's how the story ends. My favorite sentence from The Demon Lover comes from the last paragraph of this short story, and it says, "Through the aperture, driver and passenger, not 6 inches between them, remained for an eternity eye to eye." I really like this because it shows that Mrs. Drover really has to face her past. One similarity that I found between Preludes and The Demon Lover was that they are both very chaotic. Preludes is chaotic just because of the layout, and the way it's laid out you have to read it multiple times to be able to understand it clearly. And The Demon Lover is very chaotic because it takes place during the time of a war. Another thing that I noticed was similar between The Demon Lover and Preludes is that they're both very confusing until the end. You don't really understand what's going on in Preludes until you read the last movement of it, and in The Demon Lover, you kind of have to wait until you get her background understanding. One literary device used in Preludes is free verse. This means that the poem has no pattern to it. The rhyme suits the meaning of the poem. This means that there's no pentameter or it's not all rhyming, and it really went against the way that people used to write poems in the past. The second literary device used in Preludes is a simile. A simile is a comparison using like or as. The simile occurs at the end of the poem where it says the worlds revolve like ancient women, gathering fuel in vacant lots. One literary device used in The Demon Lover is the short story. The short story has the same characteristics as a full novel. The only main differences are that there's a simpler plot and a simpler setting because obviously it is shorter than a full written novel. A second literary device happens in The Demon Lover is ambiguity. Ambiguity happens because the title suggests different meanings of things that could happen within the short story. The main character could not be over a past lover, or her past could haunt her, or maybe she's hunted by a ghost. You don't know until you read the story. Now I have a question for you. Since both Preludes and The Demon Lover are very confusing until you get to the end and it's pretty much over, do you think everyone has a time in their life where they are totally confused as to what's going on until the event's actually over?